Good morning, everybody, and welcome to another great session for the European Green Week. And we're today talking about how to be safe and healthy with sustainable mobility. Indeed, that was the theme of the European Mobility Week for 2021, is the theme for Mobility Week 2021, which is coming up from the 16th to the 22nd of September. And it's important because transport represents not just, of course, a major source of greenhouse gases, and you may know that we're committed to reducing them by 90% by 2050, by 55% by 2030, but of course it's also a major source of pollution, mainly air pollution in urban areas, with what we know now are serious consequences for public health and for mortality. For 20 years now, the European Mobility Week, the European Commission's awareness-raising campaign for sustainable urban mobility, has been inspiring people to reconsider, to rethink their mobility habits in towns and cities. This year's theme, once again, safe and healthy with sustainable mobility, aligns with the Green Week's zero pollution ambition by inspiring a shift towards active and sustainable mobility, with a particular focus, I'm glad to say, on road safety and on physical and mental well-being. In the light of the COVID-19 pandemic, indeed, I think we've all been rethinking about how we move around in our towns and cities, and so the European Mobility Week is also promoting public transport as a safe and reliable alternative to car use. So before I forget, join us in September for some inspirational examples from the legacy of the European Mobility Week and its well-known Car-Free Day, as we'll be showcasing towns and cities from across Europe, from across the world, creating a safer and healthier living environment. And we'll be taking a closer look at the importance of improving our health and well-being with urban mobility. I should have said who I am. I'm Matthew Baldwin. I'm the EU Coordinator for Road Safety and Sustainable Urban Mobility. And I've got another hat I will try to find a moment to talk to you about, which is as the Mission Manager for 100 Climate Neutral Cities by 2030. Maybe I should say a word now. This is a very exciting, path-breaking new project. And of course, if we can deliver on climate neutrality in cities, it follows we're also going to be delivering on things like air pollution, on congestion, on reduced traffic deaths, and all sorts of other things. The wonderful co-benefits of bringing sustainable mobility to our cities. Before I go much further, I should say a few words on housekeeping. I think you know the form. We're working on Zoom. Please keep your microphones switched off, and I think for bandwidth purposes it would also be great if we keep our videos off. My suggestion is that we try to keep things as short as possible, so I'm going to be very, very quick now. We're aiming at an hour's discussion, and I want to leave plenty of time for questions. We have three absolutely superb speakers, and of course that's what we always say, isn't it, when we have these panels, but this time it's true. We are joined this morning by Juan Caballero, sporting the most splendid beard and matching t-shirt, who is head of the European Secretariat for the European Mobility Week. Juan, many of you will know, is a communications expert working on mobility projects at the EU level since 2015. He's been coordinating the European Mobility Week Secretariat for the last 5 years at the wonderful organization known as Eurocities, the network of major European cities. So if you've got any complaints about how European mobility work runs, Juan's your man. We're also joined by Professor Shane O'Mara, who is the Professor of Experimental Brain Research at Trinity College Dublin, the University of Dublin. He's a psychologist, he's a neuroscientist, and he's a writer. His research interests focus on functions within the brain, that is to say memory and stress and depression, for example, and on the brain in the world, using a brain's eyes view lens on social, cultural, and policy issues. His book, In Praise of Walking, a new scientific exploration, was chosen by the editors at Amazon as one of the best science books of 2020. And I warn you, Shane, I'm going to ask you about the sea squirt during our discussion, so please be ready for that. And our speaker, last but not least, we're delighted to be joined by Annika Dagan, who is the Deputy Director at the UITP, which is the International Association of Public Transport, based here in Brussels. She's Deputy Director at the UITP's Europe Department and responsible for transport policy and strategy. She joined the UITP in 2013 as the policy expert for road transport, buses, and energy and fuels. And at the same time, she moonlights as head of the European office for, I knew I was going to regret saying this, the Verband Deutsche Verkehrsunternehmen, the VDV, also in Brussels. So as you, I'm sure, would agree, we've got an outstanding panel. Two more words, if I may, about what we're doing in the European Union. We have proudly, since the end of last year, got a new strategy. It's called the Sustainable and Smart Mobility Strategy, and it is attempting to grasp by the neck the problems we face on sustainability in particular. We know that in road transport is the only area where our emissions are rising, and guess what rises with emissions? Yes, air pollution rises as well. So our new approach, as set out in this, very simply, is to make sure that all modes of transport become sustainable. It's no longer enough just to talk about modal shift. We have to make all modes sustainable. We have to provide alternatives for those modes. Some modes are going to take longer than others, aviation and shipping, for example, and we have to incentivize the use of those new modes. That will be crucial if we're going to succeed. As part of that rollout of that new sustainable and smart mobility strategy, we will be bringing forward later this year a new urban mobility framework. Again, those of you who've been following our policies for years will know that we haven't updated what we've been doing on urban mobility since 2013. And this will be a big overall look at all the different ways we can improve our sustainability at the urban level. And we've got some quite interesting ideas, including we'll be looking at the legislative framework. And the point I just wanted to flash to you now, this is a whole series of advertisements, is that we are about to launch an open public consultation. And that will be open for, I forget, 2 months or maybe 3 months. And that is the moment where your voice must be heard. If you've got ideas that you want to get across, whether it's on public transport or on active mobility or anything at all, now's the time to do that. And we'll be organizing 5 different consultation workshops on different topics of interest to allow the urban mobility practitioners, the stakeholders and the public to have their say on all the different policies and priorities that we should be addressing at European level. And perhaps it will be possible to post in the chat the times and dates of those different workshops. I probably I should have checked whether it's possible beforehand. If not, we'll send it round by mail. But they start on the 14th of June and they run through the 28th of June. 5 great workshops. Please join them. Let's use this terrible COVID situation to be able to join up and get our views across. You've heard more than enough from me. I'd now like to begin with our first speaker, once again, Juan Caballero from Eurocities. Over to you, Juan.
Good morning, Matthew. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Today, Matthew, I'm going to share with all of you my heart. You can see here behind me, you can also see in the screen, this is the image that we have selected, we are using for European Mobility Week 2021. You already mentioned it. Eurocities, the organization where I work in, together with the ICLE and Policy, we are managing the European Secretariat of the campaign on behalf of you, on behalf of the European Commission DG Move. And the official name of the campaign, of European Mobility Week campaign, is the EU flagship campaign on awareness raising on sustainable urban mobility. It's a super long one, but European Mobility Week is a recognizable brand by everyone. So this year, to promote the theme of safe and healthy with sustainable mobility, we have a call to action: move sustainably, stay healthy. And last year, if we look back in time, in 2020, European Mobility Week focused on zero emission mobility for all. That was in 2020. But this year, in 2021, as this session, we are focusing on safe and healthy with sustainable mobility. 3 topics within one theme: safety, health, and sustainability. So we can talk about many things during this session today. If 3 topics within one theme wasn't enough for 2021, in 2021 we are also celebrating the 20 years of European Mobility Week. In 20 years, you can imagine, we could have many examples of or good practices of activities to raise awareness on sustainable mobility, working on different topics. More than 3,000 towns and cities on average participate every year. Last year it was almost 3,000 towns and cities in more than 50 countries in Europe and beyond. So you can imagine the big database, the big source of information that we can have here. I'll try to gather and give you only few examples all of this rich list of activities. But to explain a bit more the context of the theme of this year, safe and healthy with sustainable mobility, I think we don't need to explain that the selection of this theme is in context of the post-COVID time. If we can already talk about post-COVID, one day sooner or later we will be able to do it. But there will be some consequences, and we are already experiencing some consequences, like issues in the mental health of Europeans. As a sustainable urban mobility campaign, we have always cared about physical activity, physical health. But this year, we wanted to put the stress, we wanted to put the accent also in mental health. We care about you. As the question, in a way, was, I mean, if the way we move, it's a good part of our lifestyles, definitely the way we move, we have an impact in our mental health, in our well-being. So how we as local campaigners in the more than 2,000, almost 3,000 towns and cities organizing European Mobility Week, how can we contribute to the well-being of Europeans? To explain all these things, we have created a 20-page document. We call it the thematic guidelines. This is already available in English on our website. Very soon it will be also in other EU languages, and there I'm not going into the details. You can read the 20 pages whenever you have time if you're interested. But then in different chapters you will see you will find the answers to different questions, like what is European Mobility Week, how you can participate. You will find more information about the 20 years of the campaign, the connection with other EU initiatives, like, for example, today, the EU GreenWeek, and you will find more information about the theme, safe and healthy with sustainable mobility. We structured the guidelines in 4 chapters, talking about mental health with some facts and figures, and then with some supporting best practices or good examples. The same structure for physical health with facts and figures, and then you will have some examples from European cities. In another chapter, we will focus on safety with more facts and figures and more examples coming from European cities. And we will have a last chapter, of course, on the COVID-19 response with some facts and figures, and with the response, with the examples that some cities gave to this exceptional situation and the lessons that we can learn from them. I only have 5 minutes more. Matthew, I think, correct me if I'm wrong. Stop me if you need to stop me at some point.
You've got 3 minutes more, Mr.
Okay,
Cavallo.
3 minutes. So in 3 minutes, we will quickly travel to some European cities. Are you ready, Matthew, for the trip? Sustainable trip?
Go, go, go.
So if our first stop will be in Bansko in Bulgaria, where they decided to plant more trees and have less cars in permanently pedestrianized areas. If we move now to another city in Croatia now, sorry for the pronunciation, Drniš. This image is quite powerful actually, because it shows how they use the public space during European Mobility Week to promote health and a healthy and an active lifestyle, but it also shows this pedestrian area with the share bikes there in the background, and even more, a pharmacy in the corner, so you can even see the connection with the theme of health. Our next stop is in Portugal, in a small town called Albergaria Villa. This image is quite powerful as well. It comes from an activity from last year. It really shows how young people was helping to deliver essential products to people living in the city, in the town. But in this Portuguese city, they decided to do it by cargo bike, showing the potential of cargo bikes for the deliveries. Let's not forget that during this last month, we all have ordered something on the internet. So deliveries, I mean, when we're talking about mobility, we are talking about people moving, but also goods moving. Let's not forget about this. This is the image from Portugal, quite powerful. Bilbao recently won the EU Urban Road Safety Award. They were very brave in limiting the speed at 30 kilometers per hour in the whole city area. You can see there, Matthew. I think you cannot see Matthew right now on the screen, but he has behind this 30 speed limit signs in his office. It's the standards for road safety and for good quality of life in our cities. Our next stop gives us an example from Germany, in Essen. They involve people of all ages and focus on safety and making cycling more comfortable. This is also very important in European Mobility Week, involving people of all ages. And one of the decisions that normally usually are a bit complicated for decision makers, for local politicians, is to change an area dedicated for road traffic or for parking into other purposes. They did it in Krakow. At the beginning, the feedback wasn't good, but in the end, after a survey, 75% of people declare that they don't want cars to be returned in their parking places. And now you can see the image how this square is used now, now that they have removed the cars from that square. Very quickly, I'm going now to Austria. In Vienna, they also work with our visually impaired colleagues, and politicians were in the shoes of a blind person for a day. And the next image in Greece is also quite nice because it shows the old times combined with the future that is actually already the present. Is of course the implementation of electric charging for electric vehicles and making this medieval city a smart city. This is, I think, almost the last stop in our trip is in Sweden. We go north now in Karlskrona. They transform for a day the public space into a living space involving everyone in the city. In Bologna, in Italy, they have a very nice campaign showing the potential of cycling to contribute to your physical and mental health. And they implemented an emergency plan for cycling, and they focus on the rights to public space. And the last image is a very nice one, very colorful one in Cork, in Ireland. They really show the spirit of the campaign. It's we are talking about something really serious. We are talking about health. We are talking about safety, but we can also do it in a very engaging and interactive way. So that's a bit my trip, thanks to the European Mobility Week activities across Europe. Matthew, if you have any questions, we will maybe have time later for those. And I'm now curious to know more about the other speakers.
Fantastic, Juan. And my teasing aside, I really want to thank you for the wonderful job you do on European mobility work, working in close harmony with our team here at the Commission. And that was a fabulous tour. Just to finish with the last slide, the conversion of space in the livable spaces that we're all looking to see. We're seeing that across Brussels because you can't eat inside restaurants. And so guess what? We're sacrificing parking spaces to make places for people to eat outside in the fantastic summer weather of Brussels. And it's proving to be very, very popular. I should have said, I'm not a very good chairman. If you want to pose a question, and we're delighted if you do, you need to do so through Slido. I'm sure you all know how that works. If you don't, it's www.slido, Slido, And when you're in there, you enter the code EU GreenWeek 2021, all lowercase, all joined together. Again, it's EU GreenWeek 2021. And then you have more choices, and you should choose session 2.1, safe and healthy with sustainable mobility. And then you'll be able to pose your question directly to our wonderful panelists. And if you're interested to tweet about this fabulous event, please use the hashtag EU GreenWeek. And I was just having a look, and there's quite a lot going on already. So if you want to get your points of view across on Twitter, or if you want to ask a question, please do so. Without any further ado, let's go to Professor Shane O'Mara from Dublin. Shane, over to you, sir.
Hi, how are you? I'm delighted to be here. This is just a wonderful occasion. And when I attended in Brussels a couple of years ago, the circumstances were very different. So it's great that this event is happening at all. So I'm a neuroscientist and psychologist, as has been mentioned, and I'm also an avid walker and have recently written a book on this topic, trying to take a brain's eye view of walking and presenting walking from a very different point of view. And one of the principal arguments I make is that walking is social. This is something that we forget, and it's something that we overlook. But we evolved as social walkers, and that's how we conquered the world when we walked out of Africa. We did it together in groups, in families, in tribes. We didn't do it alone. So we're very, very keenly attuned to each other as walkers. And in the first slide here, I want to show you an example of that. So on the top, we have a quote from the anthropologist John Napier, who alleges that human walking is a unique activity where we teeter on the edge of catastrophe. But the little piece with John Cleese just below shows quite differently. And there we go. If you just watch him, he's able to nod to somebody and catch their eyes as he walks past. So he's able to engage in social cognition while engaged in physical mobility. This is a really, really remarkable thing. And he doesn't teeter on the edge of catastrophe despite engaging in what is, in effect, a silly walk, as a representative of the Ministry of Silly Walks. Now, let's just focus on humans for a moment. The last 10 years has brought us great advantages in understanding how much people walk, because we can capture data on a scale that is utterly unprecedented. So what I want to do is just focus briefly on this study by Tim Ailtoff and his colleagues. And what they've done is grab an astonishing 68 million days of activity by over 700,000 people across the world. And the news really isn't that good. Humans in high-income countries walk around about 4,000 to 4,500 steps per day on average, with a range somewhere between 3,000 and 6,000 steps. The Japanese walking the most, and the Saudi Arabians walking on average the least. And this in Saudi Arabia is because of the poor provision of walking infrastructure. Sidewalks, pavements and things like this are not especially present. Humans in the wild, if you focus on humans in hunter-gatherer places, for example, walk somewhere between 12 to sometimes heroically 40, 50,000 steps a day, and can do this day in, day out from about the age of 2 to 3 all the way to the end of life. So we've built an environment that militates against walking, and we can show this. If we focus on the walkability indices of American cities, for example, and plot the amount of walking that people can do depending on how walkable those cities are, what we see is that high walkable cities like New York, people walk a lot in the morning, they walk a lot again at lunchtime, and they walk a lot again in the evening. And this effect is replicated at weekends. They walk consistently right throughout the day. Whereas low walkable cities, this is cities that are dominated by car transport, people walk very little and drive a lot. So our urban design has a really remarkable impact on how much walking we are capable of engaging in. Now, walking is good for you for all sorts of reasons. I don't make the argument in my book that we should walk solely for health reasons. I think walking is a core component of what it means to be human and of the human experience. But it is important to point out that walking has profound effects on physical and mental health. I'm going to focus on a particular study, which is this very large-scale study conducted in Australia of about 34,000 people who were healthy when they were inducted into the study. So this is a prospective cohort study, so people are followed at the start. They have no mental health and no limiting physical conditions, and they're followed over a period of about 11 years. There are many, many studies like this now. The WHO has conducted them, and they've been conducted in many, many countries. Key point here is that people who engage in minimal amounts of physical activity, about an hour a week, are at a much reduced risk of suffering from major depressive disorder compared to people who don't move at all. So we're built for movement. Our bodies and brains profit from movement, and regular movement throughout the day, throughout the week, is really something that we should be engaged in. And a key point I want to get across is that we need to rescue walking from hikers. That sounds paradoxical, doesn't it? But what we need to do is walk much more throughout each day, and not reserve walking as an activity that we engage in on a Saturday to wipe out the week's indolence. That's not how it works. Our bodies and brains are built to engage in regular movement right throughout the course of every day and profit from it every day. Now, as is well known, the population of the world has shifted decisively towards urban areas, and the majority of the world live in towns and cities now. So this means, by definition, most of the walking that is going to happen will be in towns and cities. So the onus is upon us to think about how our towns and cities are designed to facilitate walking. And I want to put this in a particular context, one that has been highlighted in the case of China during the week from their resiling from the single child policy because of the demographic profile of their country. Everywhere we look, people are living longer. And this brings with it some of the issues that occur with age, in particular frailty and mobility problems. And are we designing our towns and cities to facilitate movement in people who are older? The answer is actually probably not. So this is a UK study, but I think a very important study. They gathered a population of people aged 65 plus, more than 3,000 adults, and they found that 84% of males and 94% of females tested had a walking impairment. And this walking impairment was such that people were not able to cross the road in the minimum time required by pedestrian crossing lights. These are designed for adults who can walk about 1.2 meters a second, rather than adults who walk at a slower pace than this. We really need to focus on the needs of the people who have mobility problems. And Juan had a beautiful illustration of that with politicians being required to step in the shoes of somebody with a visual impairment for the day. It's easy for young, healthy males and females to design towns and cities around their needs. We really need to step into the shoes of people with other needs. I just want to give you an acronym, which I think is, I hope, an easy one to remember, if you will excuse the pun. This is Taormina in Italy, one of my very favorite places. And the acronym I want to give you is the phrase EASE, for thinking about urban design. Our towns and cities should be easy to walk. They should be accessible to all. That means people with mobility impairments, people with visual impairments, all of those kinds of things. They should be safe for everyone. That means getting cars out of the way. And then finally, they should be enjoyable for all. Walking the Passeggiata in Italy is one of the most wonderful things I think anyone can do. You are lucky enough to be able to go to Italy and hang out there. This is one of these wonderful evening traditions where everybody engages in social walking. Coming back to my point from earlier on, that walking is actually a social phenomenon. It's not merely a personal mobility phenomenon. Paris is doing this wonderful transformation. I haven't been to Paris recently because of the pandemic, but I look forward to my next trip. Dublin is now talking about doing it in a 20-minute rather than 15-minute version. I'm good with that as well. I hope it happens. But the key point here is that giving space that was formerly given to cars, to people and to services really transforms how people see and use the city on their doorsteps. And coming back to this theme of mobility, I just want to tie, I'm coming to the last slide or two now. One of the key health challenges we have to deal with in the coming years is arising from aging, and this is the issue of dementia. Dementia is, the risk for dementia rises with age. The best predictor that you're going to get dementia is the fact that you're getting older. But people shouldn't take dementia as being something that is inevitable. What we actually know is that dementia can be prevented in about 40% of cases. And this very important paper from the Lancet Commission demonstrates that. And at the core of their recommendations is a far-reaching policy change, which is to introduce movement into everyday life. Hence my point at the start of rescuing walking from hikers. And I love hiking, but the key point is regular movement each day throughout the day, rather than engaging in a little at the weekends. A lot frequently is much more appropriate. Exercise reaches into every organ system of the body. As I already emphasized, it has an important effect on dementia, on the prevention of dementia, but it also is a social phenomenon. It reduces inflammation in the brain. It reduces cardiac disease. There are a whole lot of other things that go along with regular, reliable movement. And I argue for walking because it is the most accessible and easily engaged in form of movement. So I will conclude on this point by saying we should be sitting less and we should be standing more. And that goes for all of us who are present here today. Thank you.
Well, in a moment, in your honor, Shane, I will stand, but just right now I'm going to carry on sitting to make the link between the next panelists. That was absolutely fantastic. So much to think about. Walking as a city design issue, walking as an equity issue, I'd like to come back to you on. The whole issue about, you know, is it just something that the white metropolitan elite should be doing or encouraged to do? The provision of payments tends to be much better in rich areas where everyone has cars, which is a strange one. And I love the idea of saving walking from hikers, the same way we maybe need to save bikers from Lycra. All of this nearly rhymes. It's the same concept, which is let's regularize making these active mobilities part of our lives. That was tremendous. And of course, the last part of the equation for sustainable urban mobility is public transport. And that's why we're so thrilled to have Annika with us, Annika Dagan from the UITP, and the floor is yours, Annika. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Matthew, and thank you for inviting us to this panel. I'm very thrilled to be here. We need safe public transport for clean and healthy cities. So this is what I'll be talking about now in the next couple of minutes. Let me start by giving you a bit of background information of how the COVID pandemic has hit the public transport sector. So during the first lockdown last year, we saw a passenger loss of up to 90%, which was very drastic. And still now, after the third lockdown, we don't see the usual passenger numbers that we used to have in the past. We have estimated that last year across Europe, the pandemic has cost our sector around 40 billion euros losses in terms of farebox revenues that were missed. And very early on throughout the crisis, the public transport companies have followed the measures that were recommended, meaning that masks had to be worn by staff and passengers, increased ventilation was ensured in the vehicles and stations. We have reinforced cleaning and disinfection of surfaces, communicated about the rules, and of course made sure they were effective and avoiding crowds and so on. So a number of measures to make sure that it was still safe to travel with public transport. Meanwhile, a number of studies have been done, and really several studies, but I've only listed a couple of them here to illustrate, that have looked into how big the risk is to catch COVID-19 on public transport, because it is perceived as a very high risk by the population. But in fact, all the studies point to the same results, which is that the risk of contracting COVID in public transport is below 1%. And if you look at, for instance, the numbers from France, where they found that only about 1% of the clusters of COVID outbreaks were linked to transport, and that includes land, air, and sea transport. We're not only talking about urban public transport here, the risks are really very low. And the same numbers you find about in any of the studies that we have been aware of. And why is that? A lot has to do with passenger behavior. So it is linked to the fact that public transport passengers use our services only for a short while. They usually keep to themselves. They are wearing masks. They don't talk much. They don't eat or drink. They don't sing or dance or engage in physical activities that would usually facilitate the spread of droplets. So here, I think the behavior is really key. And this, together with what the operators do, so the disinfection of surfaces and ensuring a good air renewal, altogether really limits the risk of catching COVID. And we can say that with the right measures in place, public transport is COVID safe. And it's actually one of the safest public spaces you can find in cities because of the passenger behavior we see. So we are now looking for a lot of support to regain the trust of passengers, to get this message out. We also hope for political support on this. When we get out of the crisis, we really think that we need a strong public transport sector for a number of reasons. I mean, one of the most important reasons is the environmental and health benefits that public transport has. It is quite far known that public transport emits fewer greenhouse gas emissions and pollutant emissions than individual motorized mobility does. Moreover, when people use public transport, they get their daily bit of exercise because they will walk to the station and back, and they might stand on a bus for a while. So this reduces the different health risks, certainly for non-communicable diseases, and we've just learned for dementia as well. Moreover, public transport vehicles are involved in fewer accidents than other motorized vehicles, so it is one of the safest modes to get across town. In terms of economic benefits, of course, public transport enables people and companies to access the various economic and social opportunities in a city. It also reduces congestion, which costs our economies, I think it's around 1% of the GDP every year. Public transport companies provide local jobs, which is very relevant right now after the crisis. And last but not least, their investments that are made by public transport companies into infrastructure building and IT, for instance, usually benefit local and regional companies, especially SME from the region. So really investing more in public transport has a multiplier effect, and studies in the past have shown that every euro spent invested in public transport has wider economic benefits that exceed 5 times the initial investments. So this is relevant now that we want to get out of the crisis. And last but not least, in terms of social benefits, public transport is inclusive and accessible to all segments of the population. It's affordable. It's really there to provide mobility for all, independent of their social standing. And a good public transport network will improve social cohesion, but also territorial cohesion. So this is very important. That's why we try to stress this at the moment. How can we build back better? We have learned, and Matthew, you have mentioned that the European Commission wants to see 100 climate neutral cities by 2030. And yeah, this is really ambitious, but it's also challenging, but I love it. I mean, it will bring co-benefits for health, particularly linked to clean air and more active mobility. But how can cities become climate neutral? This is what everybody is looking at now. And you could do it by, cities can do it by avoiding transport. Obviously, any transport that doesn't happen doesn't emit. They can facilitate the shift to the most sustainable modes like walking, cycling, and public transport. Of course, also improve each mode of transport. That's important. As well as pay, because I think it's safe to say that in 2030 there will still be some emissions stemming from transport in the cities. And if cities want to be climate neutral, they have to offset these remaining emissions in one way or another, which means to pay. To invest in something. And I would love to encourage the cities to think about the redistribution of space as we are preparing this transformation anyways. And we want to get away from car-oriented cities where cars get most of the public space to really have cities, more sustainable cities and cities of places. Now, I want to say a few words about our own sector. The public transport sector is currently engaged in and facing this triple challenge of decarbonization, digitalization, and growth. These are three important transformations that all need to happen relatively quickly and at the same time, and they all require additional investments beyond the usual investments that we get to do every year for maintenance or enlarging a line a little bit. But this is really more. To decarbonize the whole sector and digitalize it and grow it in order to transport more passengers. We would therefore call for support, both the cities and all politicians, support public transport at this moment. You now know, if you haven't known before, that it's COVID safe, incentivize the people to return and to use it again. And we are looking to integrate also complementary services such as on-demand and micro-mobility services so that overall the citizens will find a good alternative to the private motorized mobility. And financing is key, especially, as I mentioned, for this triple challenge that we have to get on moving on, but it will require more additional investments than we had in the past. And let me conclude with just a couple of recommendations when it comes to urban planning. And Matthew has mentioned the upcoming urban mobility package of the Commission. We would love to encourage cities and the European Commission to develop a vision for urban mobility that is centered around walking, cycling, and public transport as the three most sustainable modes, and take measures accordingly. So really think like, okay, besides developing a vision, how can we achieve this? How can cities achieve this? And I think it's worth going a step further, because as we develop visions, it's good to anticipate future developments and to take them into account. There will be more electromobility and there will be autonomous vehicles circling in the streets at one point. And I think it's good to already think how these can be managed and how to keep on a sustainable track once these vehicles come. And most importantly, cities need to look at the financing needs that they have, what is required for developing the public transport sector and really reaching the modal shift and being able to transport more passengers together with micromobility and other shared modes. What do we need in terms of financing, and what sources do we currently have for this? Are they enough? And if the analysis shows that they are not enough, cities should think about which additional tools could be set up to really meet the needs in the future. This brings me back once again to the avoid, shift, improve, and pay principle. I think avoiding is possible, although it's not very popular, but I don't think it should be excluded from the start as one way of thinking. Modal shift, we all know that 40% of road transport stems from cities, so modal shift to other modes than motorized individual mobility will make daily mobility much greener and healthier, and I think there's a lot of potential in this. Of course, to continue the decarbonization of all modes and all vehicles is very important too. And last but not least, we would love to see public transport as one of the beneficiaries of offsetting investments. It would be great if the money that has to be paid by cities to offset emissions could actually benefit the development of the local public transport sector. So with these messages I conclude, and I look forward to the discussion we will have.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Annika. So clear. 3 perfect presentations, folks. And to answer one of the questions we've already received, will the presentations be available? Yes, they will be available via the GreenWeek conference website. So let us know if you have difficulties accessing these very rich presentations that you've seen here this morning. And our last two speakers have both come with great acronyms. So we have EASE, and now we have ASIP: avoid, shift, improve, and pay. And let me start our round of questions. The questions are coming in, and that's great. Thank you very much. We're receiving them as I speak through the Slido. Still time to put more questions. We've got a good 15 minutes to go. Let me start with you, Annika, because you've come with this nice acronym of ASIP, the pay part. What about the concept of indeed fare free public transport? You've talked a lot about the external cost of transport and how public transport can reduce congestion costs, the cost of road deaths, reduce our emissions. In other words, the way to, if we want to have more of this activity, one way would be to encourage people to do so by making it free. It's been done, I believe, in Dunkirk, it's being done in Hasselt, it's been done in Tallinn, and I think as of last year, it's now also being done in Luxembourg. What do you think about this?
Yeah, well, I understand that there's a lot of interest, and there has been for a while, in providing free, fair public transport, especially with the aim of attracting more passengers to public transport. But this decision also has its pitfalls, and it has to be really carefully considered. I would not say UATP recommends it at this point, but we look into the pros and cons. One aspect is that the public transport is not free as such, but you are reducing one important revenue stream. So in most larger cities, the fares contribute about 50% of the operational costs. In cities like Luxembourg, for instance, they contributed only 8% of the operational costs. So in such a circumstance, you may rather arrive at the conclusion that you may substitute these by other sources of funding, which would then be public authorities who have to pay more, or taxpayers who have to pay more, whatever the model is decided at the local level. I think that in most cases, the price is not the main factor attracting people to public transport, but many studies have actually shown that it's the level of service or the time saved in traffic and the reliability of public transport that will get people there. So our message is really that the abandoning of fares must certainly not lead to a situation where the authorities don't have enough money to put in public transport's improvement in the improvement of the service level, in the growth of the network, because this is what ultimately attracts people to leave their car behind and use public transport instead. Yeah, it's a bit challenging because even though you may see an increase of passenger numbers once you have free, fair public transport, it does not mean that this increase comes from people who don't use their car anymore, because those people usually have already opted for a more expensive way of traveling. Having a car is more than 10 times more expensive than having a public transport abonnement. But these people who have a car, myself included, we are ready to pay this price to have our car, and we're not going to abandon that just because public transport is free. But some of the additional trips come from pedestrians who hop on the bus instead of walking, or cyclists and so on. So this has to be really carefully analyzed. I would not say it's a blueprint for any city. Yeah, maybe I'll leave it at that.
Not a panacea, not a blueprint. Very interesting. I mean, we are going to have to find ways of, I guess, improving access to public transport, but that's a very clear explanation for sometimes something which looks obvious and maybe isn't. Two questions for you, Shane, if I may, both come in while we've been speaking, to ask you about examples of low-hanging fruit in the existing built environment. So I guess the question is, which cities, in your view, have the most untapped potential to become more walkable? So that's one question. And if you could also address the second one that's come in, and I knew we were going to get this, the question about personal mobility devices, these famous e-scooters. And the question is, with the sidewalks being invaded, there's a strong word, by personal mobility devices, isn't walking becoming more penalized than ever?
Yeah, so two comments really. I think Juan has already hinted at something that I would be very much in favor of, which is to remove car parking everywhere and to replace car parking with radical green measures such as hedging, planting trees.
It's a very much the Oslo approach, isn't it?
I'm sorry?
Yeah. This is the approach in Oslo. They've taken away the car parking spaces in the centre.
And also something else, which is to remove defensive architecture. So you'll see, for example, and we see it here in Dublin, and I've seen it in many other cities in Europe, benches are divided so that people can't sleep on them at night. And this is done ostensibly to deal with problems to do with homelessness, but it actually makes life a bit more uncomfortable for everybody. So that is the kind of thing that I would be thinking about is what's the experience like for the individual, and fully burdening parking with all of the spillover costs, which at the moment it doesn't meet. You know, I don't know what the situation like is in other countries, but for many years, for example, property developers in Ireland were able to avail of a tax break for building car parks in city centres. Those car parks are now going to be, I hope, useless and need to be repurposed for other uses. So those kinds of things I would really be very much in favour of doing. On the e-scooters, look, why are e-scooters on footpaths or on pavements? They're on there because there isn't adequate provision for cycle paths, which is where they should be. So I think e-scooters are great. I don't use them myself, but that's neither here nor there. They increase individual range. The pick up and drop off model that they have in Copenhagen, for example, is a wonderful example of how you can do this. But people take to footpaths because it's not safe on the streets. Why isn't it safe on the streets? It's not safe on the streets because there are cars moving at speed, and there are too many cars in our towns and cities. So I don't blame the poor e-scooter here. I blame the overall transport policy that facilitates cars in our towns. And Copenhagen, you know, I've said a nice thing about it. That motorway that it runs up the side of the river is just awful. You know, so you can get wonderful design hand in hand with terrible design.
And a lot of 50-kilometre-hour streets where pedestrians and cyclists and cars are mixing as well, which is unusual in a town that size.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'll come back to you. I've got another question for you in just a moment, Shane, but I want to come to Juan now. What's your secret sauce, Juan? I mean, for the European Mobility Week, it's not just kept its popularity, it's increased its popularity over the years. So how have you done it? What's the magic?
Let me, Matthew, to reply to your question, or to this question, let me actually use my background. You can see here, why is European Mobility Week so popular? Basically, because you can see it's changing, the language. European Mobility Week is so popular 20 years since it was launched, because we adapt the message to the local reality of each city, of each town. We create a campaign concept that is with a theme, as I presented today, that is wide enough to allow every mayor, every city to present the plans, the improvements, the implemented measures in sustainable urban mobility, and to connect with people. Of course, European Mobility Week is still relevant because the challenges are still there, and not because we haven't managed to tackle air quality or noise pollution or quality of life in cities, because many improvements have been done in 20 years, as I showed you before, but also because there are new challenges coming, like the one you were talking about right now with Shane, about the micro-mobility one. Imagine about digitalization, urban air traffic in the near future. We can talk about drones as well. So, I mean, the secret, the key ingredient is the flexibility. This is a decentralized campaign. Someone said once that together with the Erasmus program, Carfree Day and European Mobility Week is one of the most recognizable examples of European cooperation, where you can easily see the European Commission, so the European level, the national governments and the local authorities working together. And it's not easy, believe me, when I speaking on behalf of Eurocities, the different levels of governance, the multi-level governance issue is always a challenge, and European Mobility Week is a good example for that.
So it's very flexibility. I think that's exactly right. You adapt and you change. But what strikes me is every year after European Mobility Week, people say to me, why can't we have European Mobility Week every week?
Every week.
And then why can't we have car-free day every week? Well, the answer is cities. It's up to you. I want to, we've only got a few minutes left and there's so many great questions, but I want to engage all of you now on the following question. And I want to start with you, Juan. Here we are talking, we've had passionate cases from Shane for walking, passionate case for public transport from Annika, passionate case for everything from Juan. And in forums across Europe this week, because it's World Biking Day, we're going to be hearing the case for cycling. So why is it that so often we hear the different forms of sustainable urban mobility put in opposition to each other? Why is it that there seems to be more of a competition factor between, for example, public transport and cycling, or sometimes between walking and cycling? How can we mitigate that? Because that seems to me a recipe for total disaster. Juan, what's your view?
We are not only cyclists, or we are not only pedestrians. During the day, we can be on public transport, we can drive a car, we can cycle, we can walk. So if we have learned something from these months of this pandemic, this big shocking for everyone in the world, is that we have to improve on our empathy to be, I mean, when you are crossing the streets, you have the right, I can give you a very concrete example. Just in front of my apartment, there is a school and there is this traffic lights where you can push the button and they will become green for the pedestrian and then you can cross. Sometimes when I go outside and I'm on my own, this street is, there are two bus lines there going there. So if I see the bus is coming, I'm not going to push the button.
Just finish your answer quickly, if I may, Juan. Maybe out of time.
Yes. So I mean, the idea is the answer is to be more empathy, to show more empathy. We can promote this from the perspective of cities, and cities as well. Sometimes they have to be brave. And let's not imagine anymore. When you imagine the image of a city from the air, it doesn't need to be streets where cars are moving. It can be in a different way. It wasn't like that 500 years ago. So let's think cities in another way.
Fantastic. Annika, competition or connection? Or both?
I would really see it as complementary modes, really, rather than competition. I think they go very well together. Like in Brussels, I found that a combination of cycling and taking the metro, like taking the bike to the metro station and then the metro into town, is really the fastest way of getting anywhere. And therefore, I think that these connections must be strengthened, that people can actually...
Sorry.
That people can use some modes for the last mile in addition to mass transit.
It's exactly one of the things we want to look at in our urban mobility package, in fact, to look at how we can encourage that seamless last mile mobility and indeed connection, not competition. And last but not least, Shane, active mobility, why doesn't it join up better? Is the cyclist a natural enemy of the pedestrian?
No, of course not. Again, I think we need to come back to policy and we need to come back to environmental design. You know, if we're going to have end-to-end design here, we need to think about all of the components of it. And a cyclist is just a walker who hasn't dismounted. And a walker or a pedestrian is a cyclist who hasn't just yet gone on their bike. You know, so we really need, you know, when you look at the streetscapes, you have to come to the view that the streetscapes are designed the way they are because policy and budgets have been designed and spent in that way. And we can have an alternative if we wish. So I think we have to stop blaming the individual and we have to go and look at City Hall and say what is happening at the policy level. And end-to-end integrated transport needs to be baked in to City Hall policies. Don't pick on the individual, pick on the implementation of the policy.
We've got 1 minute left, so you have 15 seconds each. I'm your fairy godmother. If there's one thing we could do in cities to improve the situation, what would it be? Shane?
Ban parking.
Annika?
Oh my God, one thing. More separate lanes for buses.
Juan.
Let people to try out, be brave.
Brilliant. You've all been absolutely fantastic. There are loads and loads of unanswered questions. I'm afraid we have to leave our audience wanting more. You left me wanting more. You've been a brilliant panel. Thanks for joining us for this great discussion. Stay with the European Green Week. There's so many other great panels. Thanks for your attention and thanks for listening.